Yes, welcome back. This is A Rap Critic. I'm your boy Malik 16, and no, I ain't nothing like you rap niggas, blog niggas, you content creator niggas, or clean version. I ain't nothing like you rap critics, because this is A Rap Critic. And if you haven't already, take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Marathon continues. We are still going over the Young Classic, which just turned 5 years old this year. We're talking about none other than Victory Lap by the late great Neighborhood Nip. And this is category 2, where we go over the rap performance on this album. With no further ado or delay, we're going to jump right into the first dimension in category 2, which is dimension 1, personality and charisma. Now, when he was alive, Nip was already a walking study in charisma. In his passing, this album has just served to emphasize that point because the words live on and you can hear the conviction. When we talk about the next dimension, we're talking about how much you believe, but what you hear here is how much Nip believes in what he's saying. And it can be summed up in one line that he recites on Hustle and Motivate, where he says, F what you saying, I'm saying this. And it's that slight raising up of his voice and emphasizing of certain words that make you know, okay, he's making a statement here. And so this album is full of statements. And I mentioned in video 1 that this is an ambitious project with Nip attempting to be many things all at once under the same neatly packaged individual, right? So he's not trying to become different things. He's trying to show you different sides of himself and showcase different positions that he's playing. So on one end, he is the seasoned veteran rapper. He is technically 10 years, maybe about 8 years known as a solo artist. And there's a lot of people who feel like, okay, yeah, he's been in, you know, like, because they consider his catalog of mixtapes to be pretty much albums, and he released almost a decade's worth of mixtapes, right? And then there's people that were just getting to know him through this album. So this is his introduction. So it's a seasoned veteran coming in with a debut album, playing the role of a new artist and having to fulfill both of those premises and serve both of those fan bases. And he does that. That same conflict you're gonna see with him repping RSC all throughout the album, but also speaking mobile talk, business talk, humanitarian talk, and just logic. And those things sometimes for other rappers would be a harder feat. He pulls it off almost seamlessly, although the conflict is apparent. You can hear the contradiction, but he doesn't leave that contradiction open. He addresses it, he acknowledges it. You know, there's lines where he's going to speak about the gray area that all these roads lead. There's braggadocio, there's a little bit of recklessness. You know, you'll hear it when he says lines about, yeah, I'm buying all these chains. I know it's an ignorant habit, but I can afford it because I paid my dues, and that's my way of treating myself. So you'll hear it in these reflective moments, but you're also gonna hear this pain. There's an aspect of pain, there's this weathered spirit, there's this I've seen a lot, and without ever using the word regret, you hear that tone of lament. You hear self-reflection and introspection out loud. And above all of that, it's in this shell of coolness. There's an unmistakable casual presentation with what Nipsey does. And he's not making things seem easy. He's making it seem like it's just every day for him. Like it's not new. He's unfazed and not jaded, but he's not flinching by things that happen, like big or small, right? A millionaire does something crazy, a gangbanger does something crazy. He's like, yeah, it's to be expected. I already scoped that out. So there's a coolness mixed with a pain, mixed with those two conflicts. And the way that they're balanced could only be a testament to Nipsey at reaching this maturity point. And that's going to be due to the very fact that he is a seasoned veteran in the game. And if you want, you can add the other factor that he's a part of a freshman class that contain what a lot of people consider to be some of the people who are on the rap Mount Rushmore and some of the best to come out of the later generation. And so his balancing act is one that only someone who has reached the level of maturity that he reached at this point would be able to pull off with that air of coolness. And so that's what you're hearing when it comes to personality. He's not so serious that you don't hear humor. There's moments of humor, and we'll talk about that as we go throughout. And when we're talking about Tupac comparisons with Nipsey, it's this idea that two conflicting forces can exist in one person. Pac had famously caught flack. A big argument that people always like to bring up is, how could you make Keep Your Head Up and I Get Around on the same album, as if those two cancel each other out, as if the messages are so starkly contrasted. Because Nipsey, again, he addresses what he's going through. There's a vulnerability on open display, what compels you to keep listening to Nip, because honestly, he's not saying anything that hasn't been said. California gangster rap is not something new. A new gangbanger rapper talking about street things is not a new thing. It's the way he's putting it together, and it's what he's saying to pull you in. And I think the deciding factor is the conviction, is the pain, mixed with the humor, mixed with the balancing act he does with those conflicting elements, plus his word choices, which we'll talk about in later dimensions. But for now, these are all things to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats when you're thinking about personality and charisma. Takes us to dimension 2, believability. So if you put aside all things that have come out about Nipsey, all things that you've researched and things that you know since his passing, in the light of his passing, and just think about how believability is conveyed on this project. I think it's decided that this is not a suspension of disbelief kind of project. At no point is Nip asking you to embrace an alter ego or telling you that he's taking on an alter ego. He's telling you, no, this is Nip, this is me. And it's further exacerbated by the lengths that he goes to let you know, which also seem casual and effortless, because there's nothing here where it's really trying. Nip's range is not going to be horizontal, it's going to be vertical. He doesn't really go into these different spaces of, oh, I'm going to be animated on this song. He just goes a little bit more aggressive and louder. So on a song like Sucker Proof or Rap Niggas, which are the most boisterous songs on here, he's not saying anything that he hasn't said on a track like Victory Lap or Hustle and Motivate. He's just saying it more aggressively. That's the only change in personality that you're hearing there. So it always comes down to the main question: how much do we believe Nipsey on this album? And so if you factor in that he sprinkles these moments, you take a song like Grinding on My Life and how he ends the song on that last verse by going into this section where he's bigging up his boy Kabi Supreme and just kind of shouting him out for being a real one. And that whole ending section of that verse is not him bigging himself up. He's talking about his set, he's talking about his small inner circle and how down they are, and how he's looking back on this instance of where things got out of hand and his boy stepped up, handled the situation, and then he takes the liberty of sprinkling in Floyd Mayweather and 50 Cent's names, who are also known as pretty tough dudes in their respective realms. And he's saying, yeah, they fled the scene with us. And then he adds at the end, true story. And there's something about the way he adds that, because he didn't need to add it. The verse was done. It was just an extra oomph to let you know, oh, I mean what I'm saying. He adds that in there in a very believe it or not way. Like, hey, true story. Doubt me if you want to. Not, y'all need to believe this, y'all should have seen it. He doesn't even ad-lib it later on. Like most rappers would be like, man, it was crazy. He just like leaves it there for you to take from it what you're gonna take. The fact that he even went into that anecdote, he does that all throughout the album. It's moments like that that make it hard to really denounce the claims of realism or, you know, the buy-in factor of what's being said here. What he does on Young Niggas, where he goes into the whole story about his brother burying the money in his mother's backyard, $250,000, then digging it up a year later and it's covered in mold, and how the whole family gathered around trying to clean this up, a concerted effort of the whole family trying to salvage the money. And again, this is a story where the highlight and the spotlight is not on Nipsey himself, it's on a member of his small circle, this time being his brother and the rest of his family. And he does that throughout. The last example being the third verse on Blue Laces 2, where he tells the story where, again, the spotlight is not on him. He's very involved, and he said, this moment almost didn't happen because he was trying to finish one verse at a time on that song, and the person he was in the studio with, OG Big Reese, was telling him, "Nah, you need to finish this today. You got a certain air about you," and it takes you into this space where, you know, Nip in the interview says this was a real moment in his life. It becomes really hard to be like, nah, it's all cap or he's exaggerated. This is what you want gangster rappers to do that they don't do. Giving you these real reflective snapshots of their lives makes it more digestible, makes it easier to be like, okay, I believe you've been through some stuff. And this is how you humble brag. Most quote unquote gangster rappers are taking a route of future projection and over exaggeration, right? This is what I'm gonna do, this is what I'm capable of doing. Nip does a lot more talking about things from recent history, old history, and just his history in general. So even in the middle of that future talk, he slips that in like the examples that I just gave you. Again, we're talking about just on this album, not only anecdotes, but anecdotes that you care about. And I say it all the time, it's really an artful craft to be able to take something that is important to you and make it important to folks who are essentially strangers listening to these snippets of your life. And that's a part of that compelling factor that we were talking about in Dimension 1. And it doesn't need all the extras. It doesn't need, there were 50 gunshots and 50 dudes. It was just like, hey, true story. You know, he just slips that story about the money in the midst of a verse. It doesn't become the focal point of the verse. It's just, he said it was important that he got that story out there. He's speaking on the craziness of gang life. He's admonishing parts of it. He's warning people, this ain't for you. You don't want this life. And you hear Nip in interviews talk about why he's taking that stance. Because he's lost so many homies to this life, he's very serious about how people depict it and partake in it. To be able to do that balancing act, like I mentioned, where your vulnerability is on display without seeming soft, not an easy thing to do. And I can't articulate truly how Nip is able to do it, but he does it in a way because that cool air keeps things at bay. So he's not bleeding on the track. He's cut, but he's not bleeding. So you get to see the conflict. He wants you to see the conflict, but he wants you to know he's good with it. And he'll say it in lines like, I dealt with it. Unlike what a lot of artists do with their media training, where they tell you, oh, you know, it's up to your interpretation. I just make it and whatever you take from it. Nip is not doing that. In the interviews, he is very grounded on wanting you to hear what he meant and wanting you to get how he put it across. So these are all things to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats when you're thinking about how believable is Nip on this album. Takes us to Dimension 3, the delivery. Oh boy. So I mentioned that Nip had a catalog preceding this, and it wouldn't be a crazy thing to say that throughout the catalog you hear his evolution. You hear him trying things, you hear him kind of go along with industry standards. He was making more poppy songs sometimes, he was making street songs with no song format. So you heard him go from rusty to trained to kind of finding his own way in the midst of that. And in that, his voice had changed. He had a lighter delivery in some earlier mixtapes, and then you start hearing more of what you've come to get familiar with after the Crenshaw album. And that defining mark is his signature voice cracking, which oftentimes indicates passion. And when we talk about passion, there's a few things that come up, but the greatest artists are going to be associated with having a passionate delivery of what they're getting across. And for a lot of our favorites, passion is what gets them over in the absence of other qualities, right? So when we think about that voice crack, a lot like another fallen hip-hop hero who was kind of conflicted, kind of controversial, kind of dark, and still a favorite to a lot of people, Prodigy, who I talked about this on our Mobb Deep Hell on Earth review, where the magic was in his voice. Now, I know in the 90s New York hip-hop scene, he was on a lot of people's top 5 lists, but when you look back, it's not necessarily because he was saying these super duper lyrical things. We broke it down that it's more about how stark, grim, and visceral the imagery he was using was, and mostly the voice. His voice is what propelled Prodigy to be a standout figure in 90s hip hop. And Nipsey has that same effect. It's not that Nipsey does anything really technically complex with his rhymes, but his delivery draws you in because of that voice cracking, which Prodigy has also had famously on Shook Ones and a couple songs in his catalog. Again, usually a sign of passion, but if we're talking passion, then we're talking about Tupac. But time and time again, it's been discussed. I've talked about it on this channel. Pac is not seen as the greatest because he's this super duper lyrical magician. It's mostly because of the passion which he's delivering his statements with, and that's the same thing you're getting from Nip here. But Nip has a little bit more going on as a spitter, and we'll get into that in the next couple dimensions. And you want to also add this California snarl. I brought this up when we were reviewing West Side Connection's album. We were talking about Mac 10 and Ice Cube, who employed that all throughout most of their careers until Ice Cube really started exaggerating it. But there's a natural snarl that comes from a lot of the West Coast gangster rappers. I think it comes from knowing that you have to rhyme a little harder on these bouncier, funkier beats. He doesn't try to play it up. The most he does, I mentioned he gets a little bit more shouty or chanty on tracks like Rap Niggas and Sucker Proof. But even with Sucker Proof, he catches himself in the pattern. Then he goes in these modes where he has a conversational talk approach, but it's never boring because there's a natural rhythm to how Nip is delivering his statements. He uses pauses like most rappers would never think to use. He's really measured and has an awareness of where to stop to let his words breathe and let you feel the attitude of what he's saying. Then he has moments where he gets melodic. You're gonna hear him get melodic on parts of Young Niggas. The way he starts it and the way he ends it, he's going into a kind of sing-songy cadence without really raising it up too much. He's like, young nigga with a young nigga, da-da-da-da-da nigga. It's a natural melodic kind of build-up. And so he's also going to add that to parts of Dedication when he's like, I'm done waiting, don't gonna go wait, dedication. He didn't have to do that till he goes full-blown singing. Where on a song like Real Big, he actually says it in the verse. He's like, that's me singing on the chorus now, that real big. There's a freedom there with Nip. He's really playing in his artist bag. And as I mentioned in video one, a lot of that is part of him having his hands on the entire direction of this project, working closely with the producers. So you couple that with the pain, with the snarl, and last but not least, the undeniable South Central California accent, right? That he's gonna emphasize on tracks like Real Big, especially in that sequence where he's rhyming gutter with stutter and clutter. And shout out to Young Bleed, because when we were going over his episode reviewing his album, he had made this joke about how from his section of the South, Californian sounded, very proper. So I thought that was interesting that we're now covering that. And I think that was probably a statement that Nip was making by emphasizing that, but it also reflects how he speaks at times, and that's that California accent. So we got the snarl, we got the melodic freedom, we have the conversational, laid-back approach, we have the more boisterous moments where he's chanting in real drill music fashion and getting louder and really projecting more. And then we also just have the accent and the voice crack, which is the signature. So these are all things to consider when you're thinking about delivery. The timing is always right because of that use of spaces and being in pocket. Nip never goes off beat. All things to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 4, the flow. All right. If you were only tuned in for the first 4 to 5 songs on this album, you might easily get the feeling that this is what you're in store for and that's all there is. Even though there is a deviation and a little break that you get on Rap Niggas, because that is a different flow, but it's not something that you obviously realize until you're deeper into the album and you're like, okay, that was a different flow because it's chanty, because it's not a standout flow. It's almost the laziest approach that Nip takes on the album. He's really just, again, leaning on every sentence ending with the word nigga and just kind of doing a simple flow that anyone could have done. I ain't nothing like you rap niggas. And that's what he does for the entire song, no switch up. and you don't realize that it's special because it's so simple. But in the midst of the first 5 songs, there's this go-to flow, which is this conversational kind of, I'm just throwing statements out there and rhyming them. So another subtle shift that you may not notice that you get in this first cluster of 4 or 5 songs is what he does as Young Niggas progresses. So he starts off in the very sing-songy melodic cadence that I was talking about for the previous dimension, and there's no real line between this being a hook and a verse. It goes on for about 10 bars, so you assume it's the verse, even though he's just repeating young niggas and done, and then he's just rhyming everything with that. So that's a simple hollow rhyme sequence, but he's really just leading you up. That's just the introduction. He's leading you into way more complex verse structures as he goes into how he really wants to spit. And he's spitting all throughout the middle, and then he kicks it up one last time to another level with the complex hollow rhyme at the end. So from the moment where you hear him go, say it's uncomfortable when you're transitioning, and he keeps that flow going, but it's so beautiful when you get rich in it, and he's rhyming every sentence ending with that vowel sound until he switches it up one more time and starts rhyming with all the words from the moment he says F for Ford dealership. Then he starts emphasizing the rhyme scheme on the or sound. So he's going Ford, we up at Forbes, rhyming with yours, and I was poor, to the point where he ends the whole rhyme on that landing sequence. And this last word is mature, which is poetic justice in and of itself, because we've been talking about maturity. That's one early example where you get the switch up, but again, it may be hard to notice because of some of the other repetitive elements of those first 4 or 5 songs. I remember that song specifically being the turning point when I started really tuning in more, because you hear that and you're like, oh no, this dude really wants to spit. He wants to show you that he can spit. He cares about the spit, because he makes it a point to end the song like that. Or you may be thinking, damn, Nip represents this newer generation, this new class of rappers, and he's not doing any of the new flows, which you could assume was really deliberate on Nipsey's, and he doesn't want to sound like he's trying to ride a wave or do anything. It's not an album that's laden with abuse of the triplet flow that everyone was doing. But on Hustle and Motivate, he does his version of it. He's bouncing with a stop and start version of that. Hustle and Motivate, they think I know the way. Then he picks it up on the third line, right? And then he ends the verse with even more syllables to really fill it out. I don't do this for nothing. And again, adding that convicted last piece on the sentence to let you know how much he means what he's saying. All these elements working at once. And you'll hear him do that bounce, stop and spill flow on different tracks. So Keys to the City and Status Symbol 3 is slow but sped up. So it's his version of a pickup flow, right? Block for me, black man, you know they trying to get it. So it's a stop and spill, it's a stutter, slowed down version of a sped up flow, if that makes any sense to you all. And you'll see him also marry elements of that with his conversational style on a track like Double Up. He's using that conversational approach, but it's still speed rap essence, right? So he's like, what you know about the dope gang? Did you grow up in the 80s? Did your mama do cocaine? RC, we for sure bang. So it's fast, it's in a faster pocket, but it's conversational and calm how he's approaching it. Then you take a track like Grinding on My Life, which you said he wanted to have a club feel. He's riding it with more of a bounce. All my life, been grinding all my life. And I mentioned how he gets boisterous on Sucker Proof, but he's landing in more unorthodox pockets. Like he's just spewing off and shouting out his words, but he's still landing them in these like crazy starting points, and it works. By the time you get to the end, you realize that you've been taken through a range of what Nip is capable of flow-wise, and these are all things to consider on the scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. It takes us to dimension 5, wordplay and bar intent. Now, intent is a word that we've been throwing all throughout this album review, and so it makes sense that everything here sounds and seems like it's purposeful. There's no wasted words, there's no filler conversation here. The most filler you're gonna get is the laziness exacted on a song like Rap Niggas, and even in that, there's conviction, there's purpose to what he's saying about himself juxtaposed with the other rappers in the industry, his peers, or the people he doesn't even respect, right? Again, he's not too good to inject humor or do some clever lines, like where he says, "Too many chains, I need a new chest." Or the way he plays with acronyms on Young Niggas, where he said, "We just sold out TLA," and he does that whole sequence where he mentions B of A and B, we LA, you trying to eat weed away. Nip is a master of couplets. That's where he butters his bread. He revels in saying what could take other 65 million words in 2 sentences, very much like Lil Wayne will say, "Everybody want to be fly till you swat him." I know I used that example before, but so much gets said, and to keep those going is the art. Instead of crazy clever lines, it's the imagery that he's presenting. It's the words that he chooses to put together in those couplets, or the thought-provoking statements, the bold statements, right? So we take a line that you've seen a lot of people quote that they really like is, on Dedication, he talks about, the slave ship. He said, "These songs are the spirituals that I swam against the waves with." You don't need that to continue more because the statement is so bold just from those 2 lines. And so Loaded Bass, he makes this one line where you can tell he's speaking about himself, but he's saying it as if it's universal. So he's saying, "There's only a few to come every generation that remind you of all the stolen greatness." I mean, the Black awareness is there without him having to be preachy. There's no parts of him preaching on this album, but it's all to get you in a critical thinking mode. And that's kind of all his mission was. Nip is adding accountability here, right? Even at the beginning of Young Niggas, even though he's doing that simple flow, he lets you know a little bit about himself in one line. Like he's going, "Young Niggas," said he grew up in the house, but there was love missing. Kind of explains so much just in a little sentence. The wordplay, he's not really emphasizing anything for you to rewind, but he's giving you a rewind factor just because of how much sensibility and how much cleverness he's slipping in there. It's not meant to confuse you because he's not using a lot of the rhetorical devices. You're not really getting alliteration or not even simile. This is not a rapper that's doing a lot of "I'm like this." It's more like actuality is what he's dealing with. And so the cleverness comes in the sentiment, what he's saying, which is probably what we're getting more into in the next dimension. But these are all things to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats when you're thinking about the bar intent and the wordplay. Takes us to dimension 6. All right, the quotability, the punchlines, or the poetic wisdom. Not a lot of punchlines, but what you will get is a limitless flow of poetic wisdom, and that's going to be a direct result of this old soul feeling that Nipsey carries with him. Victory Lap is like his credo, his mantra. It's the perfect opening song, even though Right Hand of God was initially going to be the intro track. It all works out perfectly, and it sets the tone for what the rest of the album is going to sound and feel like, and the points that he's driving home. He's letting you know, here's my take on the game. The beginning of Dedication, he starts off by saying, he does a nod to his set by mentioning the block and saying that's a celebration. But then he's like, "I'm the new Pac. I'm the blue pill in the Matrix, the red rose that grew from gray pavement." And then black niggas, like he does this whole color block sequence where he goes from blue, red, gray, black. All that's intentional. As the imagery is still very vivid. Everyone knows what that blue pill in the Matrix looks like, the red rose that grew from concrete. These are images from famous media, and he's using that to his advantage while he's making this color scheme sequence. That's where you're getting wordplay, but in the form of poetic imagery. Tracks like Blue Laces 2 and Status Symbol 3 are where I can give you the clearest ideas of what I mean by what makes Nipsey stand out from other gangbanging rappers or quote unquote gangster rappers, is how he puts things. There's other street rappers in general, right? So Blue Laces is where he really reflects on gang life the most. And in the second and first verses, he's openly kind of questioning why they make the choices they make. But in the first verse, he's really going into the snitching aspect. And the way he talks about it is from a very, very calm, civil, and logic-based place, even though it's probably one of the most ignorant staples of our urban communities is how people not even in the life hold on to it, let alone the folks in the life, right? He's trying to put himself in a position to understand it, and he can't. But at least he's doing that. Most rappers just write it off and they're denouncing them, you know, compare this to YG's song about snitching, right? But in this track, he's like, you can't understand what will make you run to the other side, to the dudes that hate us, to the dudes who cover us and break us. It's like, you can never be down. You know, you can never be respected the same way again after you do it. But he's not wishing him death. He's not wishing him ill will. He's just letting him know, hey, bro, you made that choice. You finna be excommunicated because we can't get with it. And you can hear all in those sentences, Nipsey trying. Like, he gave it a good college try. He gave it a real E for effort to really understand. He's like, nah, man, I just couldn't. I couldn't wrap my head around it. You hear the confusion as he's saying that. And so Status Symbol, you hear in both verses, he's reflecting. The first verse is more braggadocio, how he's riding around the city. The second verse, he's like, man, I'm the one that made it. It feels a little weird. I'm still not used to this transition. That's the transition he touched on Young Niggas. And he makes statements like, raised to shoot at other black men and never felt right. And he's like, you know, the homies that died, he's paying for their caskets and trying to give back to the best he can, recognizing that he's rising and elevating as a star. He's a status symbol now, and he's not all the way comfortable with it, but this is what he wanted, right? Are you ready for what you wanted? You'll hear that all throughout the album, him reflecting on how he made it, right? Even when he's like, I can't explain why I'm out in Copenhagen spending euros, even though, you know, euros are not the currency there. But the point he's making is like, yo, look at where I'm at. Now, does he have some questionable lines? Yeah, like the line about young chicks while their parents home. It's like, ooh, probably the last year you could get away with a line like that, but you barely could in 2018. So you're getting all these poetic moments all throughout the album. That's where he shines. This is why these words live on. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to Dimension 7, the concepts. Now on this album, it's not a concept album. It'd be easier to say that they're loose concepts. So we take a track like Loaded Bases. Might be the closest that we get, and mostly on behalf of CeeLo. His whole hook is baseball themed. Nip's verses are not. So CeeLo is the threading package that kind of brings it to that space. Other than that, you know, loose concepts, but they're more topics. So no real concepts here. It's up to you to determine if you feel like that means this album is lacking in that area, or it's unfazed because of that. So something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to the content dimensions. Dimension 8, the externalized content. How much is Nip talking about outside of his internal reflection and monologue? What statements is he making about life? Dimension 9, the internalized content. How much is Nip talking about and giving you of himself? So we've talked pretty much ad nauseum about how much of his vulnerability and how much of his self-reflection Nip is doing on this album. So you get a truckload of that in different spaces all throughout. Even when he's bragging, he's letting you know how he feels about this journey he's on, how he feels about the grind he's been on, how it feels to have made it this far, how he feels about the homies that didn't get to make it, how he feels about street life, the warnings, how he feels about fakers to the street life. But again, I think the external content is going to come in those sprinkles of Black awareness, of Black pride, and where he allows himself to revel in the success. So in those songs, he kind of stays on the more flossy side. So you could say that's where the content thrives. But his content is not specified on his album. It's just accented. Status Symbol and Hustle and Motivate are more about him accepting where he's at and what to do with it. They just come in movements. They're all the same points, just emphasized in different modalities of it. And so the content is all throughout. There's no empty songs. Keys to the City, Status Symbol 3, Hustle and Motivate, all reflection. Blue Laces 2, reflection. Dedication, reflection. Young Niggas, reflection, with braggadocio mix. So it's not devoid of content. You just really have to be fully invested in this album to feel the journey, because you're not gonna get it unless you listen to it all together, that it was a trip. Something to consider in both dimensions on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats takes us to the final dimension, the storytelling. I already stated that Nipsey sprinkles anecdotes every chance he can get, and he has the added effect of making it cinematic for the listener. I talked in great detail about Blue Laces 2, the third verse, where he goes into that story and he says it's based off real events. He never really goes into too much detail about the actual events because, of course, it's a street story, and if it's real, you don't want to implicate anybody. But choices made on that song verse is what makes it an artistic display. He doesn't just say in plain language, oh, my boy got shot and we had to drive to the hospital. He says, on our way from the beach, you got 3 stains. You weren't really scared. You calmly asked if you dying. Then he says, I'm cracking jokes. Like, yeah, now you finally gonna be respected. Even the way he wraps it up, it's like, all right, well, you know the drill. I wasn't there. All we seen is the spark from the talon's flare. Like, word choice. It's a poetic way of saying a story in a concise manner. We're not hearing that level of storytelling, except for like from Kendrick albums and maybe J. Cole. And even J. Cole is more straightforward. So Nip's storytelling approach is more on par with Kendrick, where it's gonna be a poetic way of telling a linear story without giving you a paint by numbers. Then this happened, then this happened, then this happened kind of format. And for a story to be that strong, only from a verse of a 3-verse song lets you know how well executed it was by Nipsey. This is probably all the story you need on this album, even though there's story elements all throughout. But if you were looking for a defining story, this would be it. It's up to you to decide whether that's strong enough for you or not on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. And with that, we conclude our Category 2 review of the young classic Victory Lap by Nipsey Hussle, none other. And you know what to do. Go leave your rankings down below, or go to the Rap Ruler, leave them, be a part of this global hip-hop community. One more time, rest in peace, Nip. You were missed. And if you have not listened to this album, go pop it in. This is one of the young classics we're doing for the year. Until next time, y'all know what it is. F a Rap Critic. Talk about it while I live it. Word to meth.